Solution. What did I say solution is? Water. It's the water surface, right, in the soil. So most all plants and soil exchange, most all plant or soil exchange happens in solution. A plant cannot take up minerals without water in the environment. It can't just jump a mineral through air from the colloid onto its bug in my mouth, onto its root hair. Okay, so it needs to have that soil solution. Look at Figure 1, page 10 of the Soil Fertility Basics. Let's take a look at that. Where's your basics book? Packet, page 10. We're in the right place. Let me borrow this here. All right, so we're looking at this here table. In the middle, you have soil solution. And I guess these are the functions that can happen within soil solution. In soil solution, nutrients can be taken up by plants, so that exchange can happen in there. Exchangeable ions. Ions can exchange between colloids. So not just between plants, they can exchange between each other. And I'll explain how that works in a second. It can hold minerals that are in its solid phase. So even though a mineral is not in its water-soluble phase, and it's just in its mineral phase, it can exist within the soil environment because it just kind of floats around in the water, waiting for something to grab onto it to react with it, or for a microorganism to consume it and change its property. No, what am I trying to say? Change its trait. You have soil solution that is created by rainfall, evaporation, drainage, and addition of fertilizers. What is this? Oh. Rainfall, evaporation, drainage, addition of fertilizers. It can hold on to organic materials and make an area for microorganisms to transfer throughout the environment. So bacteria usually have a flagella, right? A bacteria is a one-celled organism, right? Usually rod-shaped, looks like this. How does it get around? Has a little sperm tail. They're all different shapes. Most of them actually are curly-cued like that, like a pigtail. And it just little spins it like a little propeller, and it's able to go along in the water environment, okay? So in addition to all these other things, it makes a place for microorganisms to transfer around and organic material to kind of float around in the environment. It also, the water absorbs oxygen from the air and brings oxygen throughout the soil environment. Okay, so it's a lot of the properties that or the functions it has. Only plant available forms of nutrients, which are all salts, can exist in solution. Okay, a salt is not just sodium. Okay, when we're talking about sodium, most people think that that's salt. Salt is strictly across the board a mineral or a compound that can exist in solution. Can it become part of the solution and become soluble? So, there's many kinds of salts out there. Almost all of the plant available nutrients are essentially salts. They have to go into the water environment, become soluble to be able to be taken up by plants. Proportion available to plants is dependent on the amount of colloid surface. So the amount of water that's available to plants is very dependent on how many colloids are in the soil. Because like I said, water doesn't really bond with sand particles, gravel particles, only with these small clay particles and these broken down organic materials. So in order to have water in your soil for your plants to take up, you got to have colloids. When plants take up cations, they take up nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium. They release hydrogen, which is a 1+. We already talked about this on the outside of the root hair, right? Can also release other forms of hydrogen. It can release OH, which is an anion. So if it finds that it has too much oxygen, the plant finds it has too much oxygen in its system, it doesn't only release an H+, it actually releases it bonded with an O, with an oxygen molecule, which actually makes it a negatively charged anion. Since most root hairs are negatively charged, if the plant releases a negatively charged anion out of its root hair, it usually does what? Well, it can't bond with the negative and negative, it just goes away. Well, it doesn't just go away. It goes eventually and finds a available spot and takes over that spot on a colloid surface. Usually, at that point, a microorganism or some environmental factor will break these two apart, sending the oxygen out into the water and leaving that hydrogen atom on that colloid surface. So that actually happens here as well with this negative anion. Why is that important? pH. We'll get to pH in a second. What is buffering? Buffering is the process of when a plant absorbs a cation and then that cation is pulled off of the colloid, H releases from the plant and fills the spot unless another K+ is there to take its place. Okay, let's draw this. Got a colloid. It's got K all over it. 1+ ion, right? What does it say here? And then K is pulled off of the colloid. H is released. The plant fills the spot. Okay. So, a K is released by a colloid. Actually, what happens is the root hair says, I really need some K. And it doesn't really send out a signal, but what happens is a K gets released by the colloid. So it's bonded here, right? And then all of a sudden the bond is released. K comes over here to be absorbed by the plant. Because it's a higher weight than the hydrogen, it kicks it off. Boop. Right? We understand this concept so far. Well, what happened to that H? Ooh, it's just kind of floating around in the solution, right? Floating around. Negative charge of a colloid, cation exchange capacity. That hydrogen, being a 1+, where does it go? Boop. Right there. Right? K, and then the hydrogen. They basically switch places. K gets absorbed. What happens? right? So this happens all day long. Now what does it look like? What's the only thing left over after we're all said and done? A whole bunch of hydrogen down there. Okay? So this is buffering. Okay? This is the issue of, can you put enough K in the environment so that this doesn't happen? Starting over at the beginning where we were, what happens if I add K to the soil environment? K is just raining down. I mean, it's just all over the place. It's all over the place. Just kind of floating around there because there's so much K that it's taking up all the colloid surface, and it's just floating around there. Plant says, I need some K. This one goes there, gets absorbed from there. The H comes off, and it just floats around in the environment because there's all these spots are still taken up. All these spots are still taken up. Where does it go? Leaches out. It's gone. Okay? So this is buffering. Can you buffer? Can you add so much K that the pH does not affect your plants taking up your nutrients? Does that make sense? It's a really difficult one. Please.
Spend too much money.
Yes, an incredible amount of money, which is why crop selection is super important. Knowing, first of all, what your soil is, how does it behave, what is the pH of it, and then you understand which crop to do based upon that. So you can't figure out what you're going to grow until you've mastered your soil. Totally understand it. Okie dokie? Buffering? Oh, that's a tough one. Yeah. You're going to point that at me. Ions held by exchange complex, humus, clay. Yeah, we already went through this. I already touched on that. Okay, let's learn a little bit about, did I give you a signed reading on how plants absorb nutrients in the book? You don't know, you don't read it. Let's talk a little bit about how plants absorb nutrients. I've taken you to the point where the fertilizer is in the farmer's hand. He puts it on into the field. It gets absorbed by the water and becomes water soluble. It then gets moved onto a colloid surface, and then it gets moved onto the root hair. I've taken you that far, right? Once it goes in, it gets touched by the root hair, what happens to it? Just barely briefing on this because I don't want to get too much into physiology. But let's look over here. Soil particles. You have colloids out here, right? Colloid, colloid, colloid. They're just kind of, everything is cross-sectioned. Not cross-sectioned. Yeah, cross-sectioned. So everything's kind of cut in half, right? Colloids have ions on them. You have some nitrogen, some K, some iron, right? And so on. They're bonded to the colloid surface. Through the charge of the root hair sends out a charge, and these cations will then move to the root hair. You got that so far? Where does it go from there? There's two pathways on which plants absorb nutrients. There's the symplastic route. Don't worry, this isn't on the homework. Symplastic route. Symplastic meaning it basically is able to be absorbed through the cell wall. Now, you got to remember that root hairs not roots, but root hairs. The microscopic one-celled hairs are just that. They're one cell. So let's look at this. This is the cell wall. This is all one cell. So it can enter through the cell wall. It gets absorbed by the plant. The plant accepts it. It literally says, okay, I kind of like you. Yeah, okay, you're the right guy. Come on in. And it will actually allow it to become porous in its cell structure and allow that mineral in. It then gets brought into the cell, and the same way that it was accepted in here, it gets passed from one cell to the next, all the way through the cortex until we get to the phloem and the xylem. Okay, cortex. It's just starch, protection, meatiness. It's the root, right? The fatty, thick root. Well, most of that is just filler, right? It's just protection. It's just structure. That structure is the cortex. The one cell, the very small one cell that's on the outside of the root, that's going to be the root hairs. That's the protective layer. It goes in through the cell wall, passes through the cortex, and every cell through the cell wall. It gets to this area. When you look at any plant and you give it a cross section, there's usually that most dichotic plants. We're not talking about grasses right now. Or palms. We're talking about trees and crops that you're usually used to. Right in the center, you have a little kind of ring or a white-colored center. On the outside of that, you're going to have a little bit more of a darker colored center. And what we have here is phloem and xylem. Phloem does what? Xylem does what? They have two very distinct functions. Xylem, the one in the middle, brings water up, nutrients up, microorganisms, enzymes, and hormones. Up. Phloem does what? Down. Flows downward. That's how I remember it. Phloem going down. So all this stuff goes up to the leaves and does what? Creates sugars. There's all that activity goes on, chlorophyll activity. All of a sudden sugars are produced. What does it need to do with the sugars? It needs to give it back to the rest of the plant. So then it brings it down. And then as the sugars come down, they'll go into the cells and go throughout the entire plant. Okay. There's also the other pathway, which is apoplastic. This is a mineral that goes in between the cell walls, all the way through the cortex without actually penetrating cells and going in through here to the xylem, so it can be passed throughout the rest of the plant. Two different pathways, usually plant-specific on how it does this, and it might also be nutrient-specific. So some plants might actually only take up nitrogen this way, and then phosphorus, like it says here, it takes up iron this way, and then only N and K this way. So it depends on its plant structure, its species, all that stuff. But those are the two pathways in which nutrients go throughout the plant. I didn't want to leave you at the root hair, because at that point it's like, yeah, it takes it up, and then Santa Claus comes along with the tooth fairy, and then they, right? Okay. Look at that picture over there. All that K raining down. We're going to talk about that in a second. That is a process called mass flow. How do ions move in solution? Two ways. Ions, remember, picture an ion in your head. How does it move? Well, with mass flow, it moves ions rapidly through the soil solution. Based on concentration of a particular nutrient, interaction between the nutrient, the colloid, the porosity, and the water holding capacity. Basically what I just said over there. All this K moves through the environment so rapidly and with such numbers that it will change the interaction between the plants and the colloids. Almost every single time you fertilize, that's mass flow. Also, diffusion. We'll look at a table in a second, or I guess it's an image in a second that explains this. But diffusion, well, all colloids are covered with a thin layer of water, right? Let's go over here. Oh, I don't have a blue one. Purple. Okay. Colloid. Colloid. You have a colloid. It has a negative charge, right? Bunch of negative ports. And you have Ks, which are positive, right? And you have another colloid next to it that doesn't have anything on it, which can happen through mass flow or mass action. Remember, all colloids have a layer of water around them, right? A thin layer all the way around, like a planet. This one has it too. Well, these are kind of spinning throughout the environment. And what happens when I said you take a drip of water and you put it close to another drip of water? Bond together, right? You get these close enough, you have this wonderful connection that happens between the colloids. They're bonded together through covalent bonding of water. Well, negative charge, negative charge. But when a port on a colloid surface has nothing versus when it's holding something, it has a little bit stronger charge. So what will happen is this K will go over here. And then this K over here will also go over here until it reaches pretty much an equilibrium. That's diffusion. These elements, or these minerals, transfer throughout the soil environment through diffusion from one colloid to the next colloid to the next one to the next one. So actually, over time, the K can move 2 centimeters, maybe in a month, 2 months, until it reaches a root hair and then it's absorbed. Okay? 2 different ways ions move in the soil: mass flow, diffusion. Yeah, okay. Number 9, no, that's not it. 7. In your own words, that's not it. 6. In your own words, describe 2 ways ions move in solution. Homework's real easy. Do your homework now and you'll be done with it. There's a nice, what is this, an image for you. Okay, so you have a colloid, which is organic matter. And then you have a clay particle, which is another colloid. Remember how I told you that's a clump in a sheet? They kind of illustrate that here. This sheet being made up of 100% calcium. This having some calcium and some SO4. Let's look at, what is it? Mass flow. Soluble ions move to the root with the soil water, increases as transpiration increases. So as the weight of the water comes down, it increases the speed and the change within the ions within the environment. Diffusion, low solubility ions move only by random thermal motion. Move very slowly, only 1 to 2 centimeters per season. This is a fertilizer granule. So imagine like a granular fertilizer, some 1616 or something. And it just kind of trickles out from one colloid surface to the next until it reaches the root hair. I don't know if this helps, but hopefully that explains mass action and diffusion. Probably better than I just explained it. All right, pH, yay! Remember I defined in the first day of class, pH is the symbol of the logarithm for the reciprocal of hydrogen ion concentration in a gram atoms per liter used to express the acidity or blah, 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 blah. There's the equation in the bottom, just in case you need it. But essentially, pH is telling me, as we've learned today, how much hydrogen is in a solution. It will dictate how nutrients are exchanged. We all understand why this is important now, right? Let's talk about pH. All right. A short explanation of soil pH. Soil pH changes during a reaction between parent material and water. You could have an acid environment, a neutral environment, or an alkaline environment. This is wrong. It should be 0.1. 0.1 to 14, that's the scale of the pH scale. I did this on the first day. Oops, not 0. 7, right? 0-ish, 14. This is going to be your acid. These are alkaline. And this is neutral. Neutral. I can't spell neutral. I'm forgetting a letter there. It's NEA. Neutral. Right in the middle. So, most soils in Hawaii are going to be where? In the acid side. Why? Talked about that earlier. Has a lot to do with those two minerals I mentioned. Aluminum and iron. Lots of those. Therefore, it creates an acidic environment because of those charges. Okie dokie. We understand the scale. Dissociation of water molecules. H2O, right? 2 O's and an H. 2 O's and an H. Dissociation basically happens when conditions make this molecule release these 2 oxygens and leave a hydrogen. How does that happen? If you leave a drip of water on a table and you come back 3 hours later, what happened? It evaporated, right? Well, what happens there? Certain conditions allowed those 2 oxygens to leave and leave the hydrogen there. These become O2 gas, goes up into the air. This becomes a gas, goes up into the air, gone. Okay? So, if this happens in solution, okay, you call it evaporation when it happens on the table, but this happens in water all the time. These molecules, these water molecules, don't just sit there and hold on to, these are my 2 oxygens and I'm a hydrogen and these are mine. And I'm spinning throughout the environment and you run into another guy and he goes, this is mine, these are mine, those are yours. No. What happens is we bump into each other, boop, I give him